All right, item number 4, discuss the deer nuisance and options for control. Chad Stewart, Michigan DNR. Welcome, Chad. Do you want to come on up and do you have a PowerPoint?
He does. Sean will help. Oh, yeah, go to that one
come
there,
over to this
you'll
one.
see the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Thanks for being here, Chad. I want to also just recognize your help that just in getting this far, you've helped us understand the issue and what some options are, and we're really happy you're here. You've got a lot of things on your plate, and we appreciate it.
Yeah, no, good evening. Yeah, and thank you for the invite, both Supervisor McCready, Clerk Brooke. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. My name is Chad Stewart. I've been a deer biologist with the Michigan DNR now for about 10 years, and we've restructured a little bit, so I'm in a slightly different position, but still very much involved with white-tailed deer management for the state and in the Department of Natural Resources. I also want to acknowledge my colleague who's here, Kara Colton, who is the wildlife biologist who oversees Bloomfield Township and several other communities. So also has experience with urban deer management in her past stops as well. So feel free to introduce yourself to her and get to know her as well. Yes, I was invited here to talk about urban deer management. Really, when I have these discussions with communities, I tend to sort of focus on 3 different options. One is the biology of white-tailed deer. 2 is the process that a community should, consider when entertaining the idea of moving forward with any type of urban deer management. And 3, what everybody's really interested in is the options. But I have a very deliberate way of going through this because the options are something that need to be considered once you determine what the goals of the community are. And that is really best identified through the process. But before we get to that, I wanted to talk just a little bit about the biology of white-tailed deer and some of the things you're seeing and why it's different here than maybe in other places that might be more rural. Really what I want to focus on with white-tailed deer is their what we as biologists call survival. What is their annual survival rate in these urban communities? And when we talk about urban deer versus rural deer, it's not that they're different species, but their life histories are very, very different. If you go and walk outside your house and look at a deer, it will probably look at you, and it might even come towards you because some people might be feeding it. You do not get that same sort of behavior and experience if you're on a state game area. Those deer are running the other way because they view humans as a threat in these rural settings. So what you tend to see are higher survival rates in these urban communities. I've seen reports as high as 87%. That's simply because traditional management tools do not exist in many of these communities. So we cannot be as effective with management. And deer populations, what they really want to do is grow to what I'll touch on lately is what we call their biological carrying capacity. And that growth rate tends to be, once it gets to a certain point, it becomes exponential. If anybody's ever familiar with like an exponential curve, it essentially increases at an accelerating rate. And that's a lot of what these communities in Southeast Michigan are starting to likely experience. So how does it get to that exponential growth rate? It all comes from reproduction. We tend to see increased reproduction in urban areas because they simply have more resources available to them. I've seen, again, reports as high as 1.8 fawns per adult doe. And additionally, you don't see reproductive senescence. There's no such thing as menopause in female white-tailed deer. So in addition to that, the cute little fawns that you were seeing this summer, the ones that are balled up, maybe in your garden bed, in the forest, wherever, if they can get to be about 80 pounds by about December, they can actually come into estrus and breed themselves. So you're looking at a species now that can breed very early. They have multiple young every year, 2 for most adult does. You'll probably see many does walking around with 3 fawns as well. That is not uncommon. And they are long-lived, and they never stop breeding as they age. that is the perfect recipe for how deer population, or any wildlife population, can grow. And then we talk about home range size. And home range size is essentially the area that an individual is living throughout their year. What we typically see in urban deer are much smaller home ranges. And again, that means they have all the resources that they need in a much smaller area. They don't need to wander around large areas and expend calories and resources to get all the food that they need. They can get all that yearly caloric intake, safety, water, you name it, from a very small area. So again, that lends itself to higher deer densities because you're packing them in tighter areas. So this is sort of what you're seeing in an urban setting with white-tailed deer. Is anybody familiar with the George Reserve? A George Reserve is a research area that's actually owned by the University of Michigan, and some of the most landmark studies on white-tailed deer populations occurred right here in Michigan. In 1928, 6 deer were put into this 2-square-mile pen called the George Reserve, 2 males and 4 females, and maybe, if it works. There. By 1934, there were 180 deer in that pen. So in 6 short years, that deer herd went from 6 to 180. It then went to 222 in 1935, so 1 year later. What's fascinating about this is that this study was replicated in the 70s. In 1975, a researcher named Dale McCullough put 10 deer in this exact same facility, and by 1981, there were 212 deer. So it really shows the growth potential for white-tailed deer in small areas when they have optimal conditions available to them. And yes, there are 180 deer in there exactly. The other thing you're seeing with white-tailed deer is a changing landscape, and their ability to adapt to that landscape is really unparalleled. So what you're seeing here is an aerial photo. Granted, this is from a location from my previous stop when I was a deer biologist in Indiana. So this is an Indiana aerial from 1999, and what you see, fairly rural setting. You see a lot of large farm fields. You see a river corridor running through there. But what happens about 10 years later is that area completely changes. Now you have golf courses, you have these small neighborhoods throughout. And from a deer standpoint, this is actually an improvement. Most people think of deer walking through a soybean field and a cornfield. And it's true, deer absolutely love those areas, but typically what comes in those rural settings also is hunting and management. In this sort of situation, you don't see that. So right now, these deer might no longer have access to corn and soybeans, but there's plenty of clover, there's plenty of hostas, there's plenty of arborvitaes, there's plenty of you name it. And I'm sure many people in this room have experience and can probably rattle off more plant species that they have available to them than I can. One of the considerations with deer management is this idea of biological carrying capacity and social carrying capacity. And this is where urban deer management becomes extremely polarizing, extremely tricky for any decision maker. So when we talk about biological carrying capacity, we talk about how many deer can the land support. And I will tell you that we should not be managing for the maximum number of deer, because when you manage for deer at maximum biological carrying capacity, they're living, but they're not thriving. They tend to be showing declining condition. Their reproductive responses starts to wane. You start to see higher fawn mortality. You start to introduce sickness and social stresses. So biological carrying capacity, while it's certainly a consideration, we never want to really max that out. The other idea is social carrying capacity, and that simply is how many animals are people willing to tolerate before they become viewed as a nuisance. And those are two very different numbers and perspectives. So I borrowed this slide from a researcher with Michigan State University, Dr. Sean Riley, because I thought it really illustrates the challenges that communities face really well. So here you've got two different, he's got it labeled as acceptance capacities. We'll call it social tolerance or social carrying capacity. And that's because there is no sort of one-size-fits-all social carrying capacity. There are people in this room that probably are not seeing enough deer. There are people in this room that are seeing way too many deer for their liking. That's why you have different acceptance capacities along the way. In each instance, especially in southern Michigan, the number of deer that an area can hold is probably more. And typically what we see is that people get fed up of deer before biological carrying capacity is reached. So when we talk about deer management, and everybody's saying like there's a lot of deer, we're starting to see conflicts, this community probably can hold more. That's just how efficient white-tailed deer are in terms of pulling nutrients out of their environment, out of the landscape, et cetera. So what you see over time is how a deer population may change. And as you start to go up that line from where it meets the intersection of the wildlife population and time, deer population can grow very quickly. And when it's in the green, people are happy with deer, right? They think there's the appropriate number of deer, they like that. There's more people in the community that say, I would like to see more deer. There's not enough deer. Well, that deer population will continue to grow, and once it's in the blue line, those people who previously said, I would like to see more, now are happy. They're seeing more deer. But now the people that are in green, that have a lower acceptance capacity, think there are too many. And this is where the polarization of white-tailed deer management comes in. Because there are different views and perspectives in terms of how many deer should be in the environment. And meanwhile, the deer are going to do what they're going to do. Once they hit biological carrying capacity, their numbers probably will come back down, and typically some sort of catastrophic event. They'll see some sort of hemorrhagic disease outbreak, which is going on in certain counties in southern Michigan right now. You'll start to see poor nutrition, poor fawn survival. Their numbers just simply will stop growing. Their population will come down a little bit, which will give the habitat an opportunity to recover, and then the deer population will go back up again. And that's the cycle that we tend to see when managing at a biological carrying capacity. So typically when communities come to us and ask about deer management, there's only a handful of things that they're considering when they come forward. And I heard a few of them here today. There's concerns over Lyme disease, and Lyme disease is a complicated procedure with white-tailed deer because white-tailed deer are a role in the cycle of the deer tick and Lyme disease, but they are not responsible for giving Lyme disease to the tick. They're actually, the virus is actually picked up by field mice. But they need deer to complete that life cycle, and we are seeing increases in Lyme disease geographic spread in Michigan, certainly in my last 10 years and certainly longer than that. We're also seeing introduction of new tick species as well. Speaking with some tick experts in Michigan State, they are starting to identify what's called a Lone Star tick, which is typically more of a southern tick, and that can carry a host of different diseases as well, but that's becoming more, I guess, identified and recognized in Michigan. We see habituation there with the gentleman with the cowboy hat, animals just sort of coming up and typically not very aggressive towards humans, but can be very aggressive towards canids, especially during the fawning season in the summertime, because they are doing what good mothers do and protecting their fawns nearby. Landscape damage, you see some damage to hostas, you see people covering up their beautiful flowers with netting because otherwise those flowers will be no more. There you see a picture of a deer in a forest with very little undergrowth, understory whatsoever. It's got one lone leaf hanging out of its mouth, and that's a very young deer, but still a little bit ribby, but not a lot of food and nutrition in that forest, and certainly not a sustainably managed forest for the next 100 years, given the inadequate regeneration that you're seeing. And then deer vehicle collisions is also one of the main ones that is really drives communities looking for some sort of resolution for their deer conflicts. So now I'm going to start moving into sort of this process, and again, I'm going to give credit to a colleague of mine. She was previously with the DNR, and that's why I kept this recognition here. She is now with Michigan State University. She's a wonderful social scientist, Dr. Emily Pomeranz. She was very involved and instrumental in New York in coming up with this concept of community-based deer management and decision-making. And her actual presentation is much, much longer, much more in-depth, much more thorough. I just wanted to pull some highlights out and hit some of those highlights for you today, because I know there's obviously a time limitation. But she identified this general cycle going through community-based deer management. 1, where you define the problem, 2, where you make the decision, 3, when you implement or operationalize your decision, and then finally evaluation and adaptation. Very basic circle, and most are probably already thinking this way, but really what I wanted to bring forward and identify this first instance was this definition of a problem. Many communities start off coming to us with the question of, we think we have too many deer. How many deer do we have, and how many should we have? And we typically push back on that line of thinking, because it's not necessarily about the number of deer or the number of deer that there should be, because as we discussed, there's different levels and views and how that is interpreted. We can certainly bring forward the biological impact, but if that's not a consideration or concern for the community, then that's probably not a management priority. Instead, we talk about trying to measure the impacts of the deer population in the community. And this is sort of maybe a challenging concept sometimes to get your head around. But what we try to talk about is, if there's 1,000 deer in your community and they're not causing any problems, or people don't view them as causing problems, and they're tolerant of the deer vehicle collisions and tolerant of the damage that they're experiencing, just people love deer, then you really don't have a deer conflict problem, because nobody's experiencing that problem. Everybody's very tolerant of the number of deer. However, if you have 5 deer in your community and you pride yourself on growing this rare orchid or trillium, and that's what your community is based out of, and those 5 deer are preventing that orchid or trillium from growing, and it's forcing you to lose your identity, then 5 deer is too many in your community. So it's all based on the goals and objectives that you set. And we talked about some of those just a little bit ago. It's tick-borne illnesses, it's deer vehicle collisions, it's horticultural losses. If there's any agriculture, that's certainly a consideration as well. It could be a report from your botanist that's saying we only see 5 species in our understory in our parks anymore, and 3 of them are invasive or exotics. It's not a healthy forest any longer. These are all things that the community has to sort of understand and determine what is the priority and how we can manage for it. And once those goals are set, then we can start discussing what the management options are. So we try to break things down into goals or objectives. And from my 20,000-foot view, if a community comes forward and says we've seen an increase of deer vehicle collisions by 50% over the last 10 years. And these are just my make-up numbers for a hypothetical situation. I don't know what Bloomfield Township is experiencing, but if we're seeing this and we ultimately think that's too many, we want to reduce the number of deer vehicle collisions That's a goal. Now we can further refine that with an objective. We want to reduce those deer vehicle collisions by 25% over the next 3 years. That's something that is a measurable outcome that you can start to monitor and determine the efficacy of your management program. And then that also helps with the management options that we'll be talking about here in just a minute, because you want to try to align your management options to meet your goals and objectives. One consideration that communities have done in the past is they've formed citizen advisory committees to really vet and evaluate these, to come up with goals and objectives and get those cleared within their community. Some communities say, I think we're far enough along where we can just move forward with it. So from our perspective, the management agency, we can provide a lot of flexibility in terms of a management response. There are a few things that we ask you to consider, and that's really to sort of protect us for your action and protect yourselves for your action, to make sure that this idea has been vetted thoroughly and appropriately. And you're starting to see that in several communities in the Southeast right now. Many of you have probably seen that Southfield and Farmington Hills are starting to take some action and have gone through a fairly elaborate process. So let's talk about really quickly some of the management options that are available to communities. And I will preface this by saying there are pros and cons with every one of these. If there was sort of a magic solution that was cost-effective and non-controversial and very quick and made everybody happy, there would be no such thing as urban deer conflicts, because everyone would just choose that option. But we don't live in that world, and that's why this is very complicated. The first option is always doing nothing. That's always a consideration. That's always an option. Community can always evaluate something and say, nope, I don't think we have a problem. We're not going to do anything. That may look like a compromise, as there are some individuals in the community that think there are too many. There are some individuals in the community that think there are not enough. And it's certainly inexpensive. There's no management action, so there's no cost, at least immediately. But what I would say that the cons of that decision, some are going to view that as an inaction. And if there are conflicts that are occurring, I would wager to say that they will not stop. They will only continue and are likely to escalate. So the picture I chose for this is a picture from a long time ago in a state park, and what you're seeing is a browse line. So in other words, the distance and that gap between the grass and the leaves growing on that tree matches up perfectly to the height that a deer's mouth can reach. And you can't see the inside of that forest, but I bet everyone knows what it looks like too. If you go into that forest, you're really seeing nothing green 6 feet and below, unless it's something like garlic mustard, barberry, maybe some beech growth, very little things that deer find unpalatable. The other option is hunting. Hunting is fairly inexpensive to communities and actually can provide an economic stimulus. What I mean by that is a managed hunt within a community. Hunters generally will pay to be a part of that program. They will pay for access. They will pay to try to be a part of the solution. And hunting, lots of surveys have shown, generally supportive by many people, both hunters and non-hunters, because it's providing food and an outlet for venison, and it's going to be consumed by people. And whether that's hunters or whether that's through a donation program, generally that's appealing to a lot of individuals. There are some cons associated with hunting. I've seen communities go forward and simply create almost like what I would call, quote unquote, a good old boys club, where they just bring in their friends and buddies to come in and they just focus on bucks, which does nothing from a management perspective. Trophy hunting is typically viewed as unfavorable for many individuals, especially non-hunters. There's also local concerns often with hunting and with safety. So just simply giving hunters the opportunity for free rein to go out and shoot deer, probably not a good idea, because you want to have some sort of control and management in a densely populated location. And then there's access issues. Many communities have small parcel sizes, and a lot of communities that choose this option choose to go with archery, and it's difficult to shoot and recover a deer taken with with a bow and arrow on a 1/10 of an acre parcel or a 1/4 of an acre parcel, because that deer typically runs 100 yards, maybe even longer, before it expires, and then you come into property rights issues in terms of trailing that animal. So there can be challenges. I have seen communities implement management programs with archery fairly successfully. Meridian Township, which is the community east of East Lansing, if you're familiar with the Okemos and Hazlet area, they have a managed archery hunt, have done so now for 10 years. But the structure of their community allows for that to happen. They have very big park systems They have large river corridors that allow hunters to get into those areas, be fairly effective at managing deer, and really reduce the amount of conflict that occurs. I'm not familiar with Bloomfield Township or the overlay and if that is a possibility or not, but it can be a reasonable solution in some communities. Many communities choose to go with what I just sort of call sharpshooting. Here you're hiring in professionals who are very highly skilled and highly trained and have very specialized equipment to come in and reduce a population quickly and intensively. And that is one of the pros of it. So this reduces a deer population very quickly. I would argue that it is safe. These individuals are very well trained. They know how and where to remove deer, and safety is always their top priority, especially if you're going with one of the reputable corporations or organizations or agencies that do this type of work. The cons, this is very expensive. And I'm dating myself here, you just can't pick up a phone book, which I guess don't even exist anymore, and go to the yellow pages and find 25 sharpshooters and find the best rate and the best one. That doesn't exist. There are very few individuals or groups that do this type of work, and their costs reflect that. It is also controversial, whether it's the lethal side of things, whether it's the economic side of things, whether it's there's safety concerns. I can promise you that 100% of the people in your community will not be supportive of this approach. But I can say that about any of these options, to be honest with you. One that often is brought forward is this concept of trap and either relocate or trap and remove. The advantage to this is that it doesn't fire a projectile. It doesn't fire a bullet to remove the deer. It doesn't fire an arrow to remove the deer. Deer are captured and they are euthanized on site. So you can remove deer in these very difficult areas where safety can be a concern. But again, the cons, there's high stress for these deer. So once these deer are captured, they are very stressed out in these traps. It could take time for the individual to come in and humanely euthanize the animal. Again, very expensive. As you can imagine, it takes a special skill set. And I will say that relocation is not going to be an option. That's something that we will draw a line in the sand on with this, because when you move a deer, you move the entire biological package that is the deer. There's also a lot of stress, and it also shows that studies have shown in the past moving deer to far areas and letting them go generally does not result in high survival for those animals. So that's something that we will not entertain as a management agency. I do not know of any communities that are engaging in trap and removal, but it certainly could be part of the discussion. I want to touch quickly on two non-lethal approaches, contraception. Contraception was a little bit more popular in the early 2000s and was just sort of a budding technology, and it gained a lot of traction initially. So the pro is that, again, it does not fire a lethal projectile, and many of these contraceptive drugs are good at preventing future fawns from being born. Again, the cons, broken record here, it is expensive. If you're already having a problem with too many deer, you don't get that immediate result. So you are not removing deer that may be causing the problem in your community. And I will say with this and other non-lethal methods that it is very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve satisfactory results in a free-ranging deer herd. And I'll talk about that a little bit when I get into sterilization. But I want to give you two examples of contraception, and this is going to be very quick because I don't know if it's going to be very relevant for the discussion. There are two federally approved contraceptive drugs currently in our country, I will say. One is called Gonacon, and Gonacon is essentially a drug that creates antibodies to the gonadotropin-releasing hormone. The gonadotropin-releasing hormone is like the precursor that initiates the development and release of luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone, which basically puts deer into a reproductive state. This Gonacon, you have to capture the animal and hand inject this drug, and then you have to boost that animal annually to continue to administer antibodies to this animal to build up the antibodies that keep it from coming into a reproductive state. Now, I will say that this drug is registered through the Environmental Protection Agency as a pesticide, and as a pesticide, to be eligible for use in Michigan, it has to be approved by our Department of Agriculture. That step has not been done. So this is a very high-level overview and a long way of saying that this is not an option here in Michigan, Gonacon. Similar results with this other drug called Zonistat. Zonistat works a little bit differently, where Gonacon prevents the animal from coming into reproductive state or rutting. Zonistat prevents implantation from the sperm to the follicle, to the egg. The zona pellucida is the layer around the egg, and it basically what this injection does is it creates antibodies for that zona pellucida, so there's no site attachment. What this does is that keeps animals in a reproductive state over and over and over again until they shut it down. So every 28 days, a doe that is not bred will come back into estrus, and the rut will kick in again. This study was done up in, using this technique up in New York, I believe up in the Ithaca area, and what they saw actually was an increase in deer vehicle collisions, because all these does that were unbred or successfully unsuccessfully bred kept attracting males into the area. So now you're increasing deer activity that's associated with the rut in October and November, and creating more of a challenge. So, but very similarly, this drug needs a booster, and again is also registered as a pesticide through the EPA, which is not approved for use in Michigan. And then I want to talk about sterilization, because sterilization seems to be the new wave of non-lethal approaches or options. Again, very similar to contraception in that you're not firing a lethal projectile, and you are preventing fawns from being born, except now it's permanent. You don't have to go in and boost that animal like you do with a contraceptive drug, which takes time, skill, and effort. But again, as you can imagine, sterilization, very expensive. Again, it's not removing the deer in your community that may or may not be the problem. And I will say that it's very difficult to achieve results. Most of you may be familiar with some of the efforts that Ann Arbor undertook several years ago. They had a 4-year project where they used both jointly lethal removal or sharpshooting and sterilization. And they actually have publications out that show that they had some success in their South Study area and their North Study area, seeing declines in their deer population by 47% and 60%. But I want to provide some context to that and look at the number of effort that was required to achieve those results. They sterilized 78 does, and they removed 432 deer. So there were a lot more deer impacted from the removal side than from the sterilization side. So just that's a context to sort of keep in mind as you're discussing these things. Typically if you're just considering like a sterilization approach, we typically require some sort of research approach with that. And I will probably encourage the township, if they're thinking about this, to consider alternatives. And I'm just going to sort of throw this out because it is very difficult to achieve the desired objectives with non-lethal approach. There's published reports out there that show you need to be effective at getting 90 to 95% of your does effectively sterilized. That is no small task. That is very, very challenging and very, very expensive. This one has come up before. Reintroducing predators. I will keep this short and say we're not going to allow you to do that. In short, if you think you have a deer problem, I would hate to be on your mountain lion committee or wolf committee here. And then there are some non-lethal options to consider as well. Fencing and repellents, while it may not solve a community-wide problem, there are certainly options that individual landowners can pursue. But again, pros and cons with this. The pros, that it is very relatively inexpensive. Exclusion fences can be successful at keeping deer from specific areas. But again, the cons, and I'm sure people here can speak to this because they've probably tried this, it requires a lot of maintenance. It's never 100% effective, so there's no guarantees, and it's not going to solve your community-wide problems. So if you are experiencing things like deer vehicle collisions or poor regeneration in your natural areas, these are not the solutions to pursue for those challenges. All of this to say, and I talked about this a little bit before, there is no magic bean for this urban deer discussion. The Venn diagram doesn't fully cover, that can point you to one thing. So typically when you're considering options, you're having to choose between 2 to maybe 3 of, are we going to save money on cost? Are we trying to avoid controversy? Is it going to be effective? Is it going to be quick? You can have some of those things with your decision. You can't have them all, unfortunately. So it's a matter of trying to decide where your values are and what you're trying to solve and how quickly it needs to be solved. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions or comments, and I appreciate your time and interest in this.
Thank you, Chad. That was a very informative presentation, so I'll just leave it up to any questions from our Board of Trustees at this time.
I don't have a question. We've lived here for 40 years and didn't have deer. So we've seen the change, as I know some of the other board members have, but there were no deer from the 80s until about 2010, and it was a novelty.
Yeah.
Oh, look at that deer. And they're friendly. I mean, we've had landscape decimated, we've had a car damaged. We understand all the difficulties, and now, we get whole families and herds in our backyard. So it's just really changed.
The history of white-tailed deer in the state is fascinating because they were actually extirpated. There were no deer at one point in the early 1900s in southern Michigan at all. People had to go to the Upper Peninsula to see white-tailed deer. And over time, that has completely flipped. So we have so many more deer in southern Michigan now, far more than the northern lower peninsula and the upper peninsula combined. And it's because we have the ideal setting for white-tailed deer in southern Michigan. Winters are not hard. Habitat is primo, like they live in food most of the year, and they have very high survival rates. We also are experiencing a decline in hunter numbers.
I read that.
Our hunter numbers, we used to have over 800,000 hunters in 2000, and we're currently under 600,000 now. So within a 20-year period, we've lost 250,000 hunters. And that's been our primary approach for management. It doesn't really help in communities like this because hunting doesn't really occur, but we're seeing these challenges occur even outside of these communities.
It's an interesting comment, Chad. I got to make light of it that we go up north to have fun and enjoy. Deer come down here for survival.
Very true.
Right. Any other comments from the board?
So Chad, we're not like Meridian Township. We're much more like Southfield and Farmington Hills. What's your recommendation for us as we have to deal with this problem? Doing nothing is not an option.
Right.
Can I just add one thing to that?
Sure.
In some ways, we are like Southfield and we are like Farmington Hills, and in some ways, we are not, because we don't have parks. We don't have parks, we don't have open areas other than golf courses. So really, and as far as I'm concerned, safety is the number one issue if we're going to take any action at all. And if we are going to take action, safety of our residents, safety of domestic animals, and before I get into any further, I'm against anything that goes on private property, bow and arrow, but we do have the golf courses. And golf courses seem to be maybe our safe haven for our residents. So Have you been in communities such as ours that have no parks, no open spaces other than golf courses? And they're private, by the way, all these golf courses.
Yes. So there's two questions. I'll work backwards here, I guess. Yes, there are communities that certainly have faced the same challenges that you have. Typically, what occurs is they start to look for, I would say, private landowners that are sympathetic to the cause. Because what you really want to do when you're talking about, especially, and I'm really focusing on, I guess, lethal management at this point. That's where deer should be removed, and trying to find, knowing that that distribution of deer is likely not homogeneously distributed across the township or the community. You probably have neighborhoods that are more impacted than others. So to go into a golf course that may not be having as many deer for whatever reason, maybe that's just sort of a throwaway and they're moving through the community but not staying there, but avoiding the conflict areas, you might not achieve your goals. So this is a long way of saying it really takes a comprehensive approach to look at like how you want to do this and try to understand where your conflicts are coming from within the township and apply your management option appropriately there. And sometimes that means working with private landowners who offer up their property to at least have that removal activity occur.
And the other thing too is we do have golf courses almost throughout the township. We have at least 9 in that range, and they're geographically throughout the township.
Yeah, and it sounds like you might have some options if you wanted to pursue that option in the future. Your question, sir, was what was my recommendation? My recommendation, before we jump into what a management approach would be, is really a definition of what the community wants to resolve. What is the main flashpoint within the community? And I don't know what that is yet. I could guess. Is it deer vehicle collisions? Is it property damage? Is the answer just yes? Because it's both of those things. Trying to understand what that is and trying to quantify or calibrate that in some way, so when you do make a decision on moving forward with a management action, you're able to determine whether or not you're being effective. So I understand not every community is like Meridian Township, but one thing Meridian Township has done is they have sort of set a baseline for what they call a threshold of deer vehicle collisions. And they try to work towards that goal. And they have actually been successful at hitting that goal. Again, goals are meant to be debated, and that is what it is. But goals can also be revisited, but that's what they do. And then they can point to their management action and showing, yes, we've gotten some efficacy in reaching our goals by conducting this activity, which has a cost to it, which has an effort, which has a monetary, cost, a social cost to it, a political cost. But to be able to do that, you need to show results, and that's clear in today's day and age. We need to be able to be transparent with our goals and show that we're hitting something. And if you want my recommendation, that's the place to start, understanding what you're trying to achieve. And then once that's defined, then the next step becomes actually much easier.
Yeah, Mark?
Just as sort of a personal question, but do deer not eat buckthorn or something? Because I've got it everywhere, and they never seem to eat that.
No, that would be considered a starvation food. So only when they are very hungry and running out of things to eat would they take a nibble of that. So buckthorn, I believe mostly, here you might, that's probably an invasive. So that is generally something that
It's everywhere.
It kills everything around it.
exactly,
Yeah.
and
It's
that's
everywhere, and
That's why we grow well here.
that's where invasives really start to take hold, is because they're not only out-competing the native species just generally, but deer are preferentially browsing the native species, which is offering an opportunity for these invasives to proliferate.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
We had deer actually kill a tree in our yard last year. It was a newer tree, it was only about 10 feet tall, it wasn't that large, and it did not survive because they rubbed the velvet off. And to the point where it takes the side off the tree. And this spring, the tree was just totally dead. Not like partly dead, like totally dead.
Yeah, we get a couple complaints every year, especially from like Christmas tree farms with deer rubbing their velvet on Christmas trees, and obviously a Christmas tree that's been rubbed by a deer has really lost its monetary value, so, yeah, they
Well, we
can.
have a friend in the township who, I'm not clear on how she contacted it, but she had Lyme disease and has kind of like long COVID. It's like long-term health issues from Lyme disease. And I call them raisins in my backyard, but we have all these pellet piles. And you see them and you see what they leave behind, and they're eating things they didn't used to eat.
Not the buckthorn, though.
I know,
Jimmy,
that's a good
while you're here, do
idea.
you want to
We
give us
should,
an
like,
update on
salt
the
it or
deer
something.
car crashes and what the data you have?
Yeah, so if we look at just the car crashes this year in 2025 alone, and you're talking January 1st through August 27th, we're at 62 already. And we are just starting to get into the moving season for the deer. Over the last, since 2016, 2016 we had 32, and this is going to be a number, and last year in 2024 we had 91. And that's just Bloomfield Township. When I did the math for the areas surrounding us, which would consist of West Bloomfield, Waterford, Bloomfield Township, Franklin, Farmington Hills, and Birmingham, there's over 200 just already this year in those areas. But when you look at, one thing that should be concerning to the township as a whole is when we look at the number of calls for service that we can track that have deer mentioned in our call for service. Our system can't differentiate if we pick up a dead deer or a dead squirrel by our animal control officers. But the number of calls for service that mentioned a deer in 2015 was 246 calls for service. In 2024, 469. So you're seeing that number of increase just in us. Those are just deer calls themselves that our animal control officers manage. So the number is increasing. So I think when Chad talks about it, I think there's a dual concern for us from a police department perspective is the number of deer calls that we're going on, and then the number of car accidents are, in 10 years has doubled or tripled. So.
I would like to just commend, it sounds like the township has been evaluating this for quite a while. The fact that you've documented these changes over time can actually make things a lot easier and faster on our end if there is a permit request that comes through. There are a lot of communities that come forward and haven't done any tracking at all. And we really encourage them to try to start, just so they can try to get an understanding of where they're at with things. You guys have already demonstrated trends that we can rely on and justify if a permit were to be issued for any type of removal. So just commending the township on the work that
Thanks, Jared.
they've already done.
So I like the idea of a citizen advisory committee. I don't know what you all would think of that, but we have a road advisory committee that's made up of members of different HOAs that I think could tackle this subject with us. They're going to come back in October to give us an update on the road situation. I would maybe entertain handing this to them to maybe study it with us and then come back maybe with some recommendations. So just a thought.
Advisory committee is a good idea, but perhaps you're not suggesting the exact same committee, but I might suggest a group of different
maybe a new
individuals who want to get
committee.
involved in the
We
township.
got a lot of people here that have a lot of experience with the problem and feelings
Yeah.
about it.
Okay.
I do have some questions for Chad. What is hemorrhagic, you mentioned hemorrhagic outbreak. What is that?
Great question. Yeah, I'm sorry, I should have been more specific when I introduced it. Hemorrhagic disease is a viral disease that kills deer, typically at this time of year, and we are experiencing some deer loss. So typically what happens is that this is a virus that's transmitted by like a biting midge. Like if you ever, on your insect repellent, you say it keeps away no-see-ums. These are these midges that actually transmit this virus to deer at this time of year. It's typically associated with droughty-like conditions because these midges breed in like mud flats. And it can be actually very impactful to deer. It can kill deer within about 7 to 10 days. So right now in places like There's one part of Washtenaw County I know that's getting hit. I think we've confirmed it in Jackson County. Last year, we had a severe outbreak in the southwestern part of the state, up down in like Van Buren County, Cass County. It can be very, very impactful to whitetail deer, but it typically shuts down on the first frost. So when the frost occurs, those midges die off. It really shuts down the transmission cycle, which is an important distinction because this is not a transmissible disease between deer. This is something that is transferred from one deer to another via a biting fly and picking up the virus and moving it. So what it does is it creates a fever in the deer. They typically go to or near water, and if they are going to die from the disease, which is not always, but usually, that's where they're going to die. So when we start getting reports at this time of year that there are deer that are dead or dying in and or around water, it's indicative of a hemorrhagic disease outbreak.
And can that be transmitted to humans in
Nope,
any
it
way?
is not transmitted to humans.
Or other animals?
Livestock can get it, but it's typically not as fatal. So sheep can get it, cattle can get it, but their resiliency towards the disease is much greater.
What about like dogs?
Dogs is not it's really like an ungulate-specific disease. And the other thing that's unique about this, it works through the deer so quickly that we can't even confirm it through a lab test if the animal's about 24 hours after death. So we suspect that's what it is, but our ability to even detect that disease killed that animal, if the animal's more than 24 hours old after it expired, our test is not sensitive enough to that. So it's very, very what we call acute. It kills animals very quickly. But it's not a human health concern. It's not a pet concern at all.
We have a large, the school system has some large properties. One is called Bowers Farms. You had mentioned reviewing foliage and types of foliage. Is there any work that you do with Bowers Farm to look at the different foliage on the property? And because that's one of the things that you had mentioned, can identify whether or not you have too many deer in an area.
Sure. I will say that I've seen some communities hire out and contract with botanists. I know there's one individual that was in the Washtenaw County area that worked with Ann Arbor. And basically what they did was they went in and did a botany survey. And with that, they identified the species and basically identified if there was what they would deem adequate regeneration to be able to replace the mature forest on that parcel. And if not, they would try to identify the causes why that wasn't the case, whether it was a spread of garlic mustard that's preventing anything from growing, whether it's deer browse, you name it. But usually those individuals can be contracted out and can get a really good glimpse into the health of your forests or your natural areas.
Are those kinds of studies done at the county level as well, or no?
Typically not. No, not that I'm aware of.
What about in county parks?
I don't know. I suspect each county would be a little bit different. There might be, that
Through
would
the
be,
health department?
yeah, that would be a question for the county parks,
I was just wondering, because the county approved, or the county had a millage pass for parks and an increase, so I didn't know if that could be used to help us out, and if that would apply to the parks.
Jimmy, hang on.
Well, I just wanted to add something onto what Mark's saying. I know the school, that we had an incident probably 2 or 3 years ago at Bowers Farm where they had a, I don't know what you would call it, but an automatic, every so often a gunshot sound would fire because they were having such a problem with the deer eating and messing with the stuff on their property. And I know it kept other animals away as well, but they did have an incident, a couple years ago that brought us out there. But they were doing it to control.
So that's probably another opportunity that we could have to work with the school system, at least to get rid of some of the animals in a safe way.
I think one thing that we're missing, and I think Supervisor McCready was kind of getting to with the Citizens Committee, is when we sat and listened to Chad talk to us initially about coming and doing this presentation, there was a lot of focus that the DNR has and the experience that they have with the safety, and also us learning about, if you do a deer culling or of some lethal way of doing it, how many of these companies or how they donate and solve some areas of homelessness and hunger, which completely I had no idea when we started those things. So I think there's a lot of information that still needs to be disseminated or explained to our community that they really focus on, that this isn't going out and killing deer in the neighborhood and being done and walking away. I think there's a lot more that is involved that Chad doesn't have time tonight to get into, that our board or our trustees or our elected officials focus strongly on the safety portion of this.
I can mention too that since that call, I did speak to some executives at Forgotten Harvest, and they routinely accept processed wild game and distribute it to, needy, and be more than happy to do that in this case too.
And then we have some sections that are near I-75. There are large areas of property there as well. Can that also be, if there are
He's
opportunities?
referring to like the exit and entrance ramps, like at Square Lake Road or Adams
Yeah,
Road.
and then we have I-75 comes around the north part, the northeast part, and heading south.
Back
Well,
where
we
the
have a
ravine-
closed school up there, too.
Right.
Yeah, you have the
Fox Hills
closed
is
school.
closed, so there's no kids ever in there
So
now.
we do have some large areas and there's a lot of vegetation in there as well. So I think, thank you, Chad, and
Thank you.
we'll take this under advisement, and maybe we'll talk about putting together a citizen advisory so we can move forward and try and come up with a plan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.